All right, thank you all. I hope that you are loaded with calories and ready for some knowledge. Whether or not it's any good or not, we'll find out. So and I don't normally, you can tell that the first thing you learn is whether I'm not a man of letters, I suck at PowerPoint, so just bear with me here. Obviously, graphic design is not my field. So today's talk is called, Why is My Elf Gay? It's Batman's fault. And then the real stuff, because all historians like to have their big title after a colon, all right? And so it's examining the historical models of the other in comic books and other static visual media and their predictive ability and limits for interactive game entertainment. Holy shit, what does that mean? All right, there, just requested, all right? So in order to try and figure out what we're talking about today, spoilers, sweetie, we have a couple of 3 points that I want to make today. First of all, that comics and editorial cartoons have tropes for what we call the other, okay? And these are created in static media. Now, I'm using the phrase static media to specifically define the idea of any media that doesn't change by our interaction with it. So whether it's a book, a play, a movie, something where the outcome is already predetermined by the author that we don't change, okay? And that these tropes, okay, so there's the thing. They're useful, whether they're in editorial cartoons or comics, because comic books often deal with the kinds of issues and stories that we see when we look at modern video games. And we can see that these tropes originally applied to racial minorities, but then also are used for sexual minorities. So that's the first big point, that there are these tropes. The second thing that is useful for us to know is that these tropes are predictive. In other words, if we look at what's gone on in comic books and in these editorial cartoons, we can see then later examples in video games of these tropes recurring. Now, they're not always linear. In other words, we can see the same tropes appearing over time. So it's not like, okay, here's one trope and then trope number 2, and it all smoothly passes between the two, but they do appear there. And that this predictive model breaks down at some point in video games, because there's a specific point in a video game where you become the avatar. And in static media, there is no equivalent to that. In other words, there's never a time in a movie where you say, I am that person, although we do have 2 Captain Americas, all right? But we do have that we never become that character, unlike in a video game where we can become that character. And when we have to become that character and that character's gender or sexual orientation is assigned for us, then this model breaks down and we have to look at new models. Okay, so that's the 3 points I want to get to today, the first 2 being the most important. So let's talk a little bit about history. Let's try and say, why is it that comic books are like video games? Well, if we go way back to the 1950s, we had, of course, the Red Scare. And what was the Red Scare? Okay, this fear of communism, right? McCarthy had his list that he said that are all people there. And along with the Red Scare, there was also what was called the Lavender Scare, because all of our scares have to be rainbow flavored, all right? And the Lavender Scare was when they said, it was part of this communist scare, that one of the heads of the State Department, a fellow, the undersecretary named John Pooferoy, which puts the poof in Pooferoy, all right? Now, old John had said that there was a homosexual underground that was inside of the State Department. Now, why is being gay considered bad at this point? Besides, of course, gay is bad in the 1950s. What's particularly concerning about gays in context of the Red Scare? This is the interactive part. Yes? You could, but there's something even more so. If you're gay, because being gay is a scary thing, what could commies do? They could blackmail you. And so the fear was if the State Department or people in the government were gay, they were supposedly susceptible to being blackmailed by the communists to spill our secrets. So there's this fear that homosexuals would leak, because as you know, that's what homosexuals do, leak. And so the thing that we did is that there was actually a purge of a number of people that were thought to be gay inside of the State Department. And at that very same time, as there's this panic, this lavender scare, where we're afraid of gay people, there's also a fear that today's youth of the 1950s is going straight to hell. And what's the problem? Comic books. Comic books have corrupted our youth with their evil depictions of horror and mystery and sexual misbehavior. Comic books were there, and they even actually, this was so important, because of a book that was written by Dr. Frederick Wortham. Wortham wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent, which argued that comic books were turning our children violent, and they even were turning our children gay. All right. Batman apparently had unusual relationships with his ward Robin. All right. And of course, as we all know, apparently Wonder Woman was apparently not only a character who had come no longer from the Isle of Thyamescra, but was now apparently from the Isle of Lesbos. All right. So this image that apparently that these characters were bad for youth and that they had to be cleaned up was something that was there. As a result of this comic book hearings in 1954, there was a creation sign called the Comics Code, which was supposed to clean up comics and make them appropriately family-friendly. Well, let's fast forward 30 years, and what do we have? Now the villain is not comic books, but who's the new villain? It's video games. And who's turning our children violent? Video games. Who's turning our children gay? Video games. Because as you all know, you all played a video game, and fuck it, here you are. All right. Grand Theft Auto. All right, anyway. And this fellow over here is a guy named Jack Thompson. And Jack Thompson was a lawyer. He has since been disbarred, and rightfully so. But Thompson was one of the main charges to try and get people to ban video games, which he felt were too violent or inappropriate for today's youth. His big target was originally Grand Theft Auto, which admittedly did have such marvelous content where you could beat up a hoe or two, all right? But he also went after video games like the game Bully, which he said was, he claimed, and I put it down here, he talks about that the judge, when the judge ruled against him that they wouldn't preemptively stop the sale of Bully in the state of Florida, he said that the judge had missed the gay sex in Bully. Now, if you've ever played the game Bully, you play a male student in this game, and you can get your health back by macking out, by kissing other people, usually female students, but there's one male student you can kiss to get your health back. So according to Thompson, kissing a boy is the same as gay sex, which only proves that Thompson never got beyond first base. All right. So if this is the tie, if there is a tie between video games and comics, what is this predictive model? What are the tropes that we can find inside of these editorial cartoons and comics for racial minorities and sexual minorities that we may be able to apply to these video games? Well, I'd suggest that there's three flavors, as it were, of portrayals. There are hateful portrayals. And there's kind of two flavors of those hateful portrayals, one that I call grotesques, and the other, which is self-explanatory, which is villains. All right? There's a second sort of stage of portrayals when then the other, whether it's racial or sexual, suddenly becomes a little bit more comfortable, and then suddenly you become the comic relief, or you become the victim, to be pitied or to be learned from. And then finally, we see people getting to this third stage, becoming real characters as NPCs, sidekicks, and even stars. So let's go back and take a look at what these grotesques are. These are all historical images of various different characters. Here we have on the bottom the grotesque of what we call the Sambo figure. The Sambo figure was a grotesque of the black person. It derived from slavery. The idea of all slaves were nothing more than children. They weren't capable of having any thought process that was more powerful than a child. Therefore, they were ruled like children. You'll see the exaggerated lips, the wide, surprised eyes, as if the whole world shocks them, or they just had Botox. Okay, there's this, and of course, and you can see why we really call them grotesques. And this is a 19th century term meaning an exaggeration, a stereotype. All right. We see the evil Jew over here. And this might surprise you. This, of course, was a view of Asians during World War II. Most importantly, you might notice who drew that picture. Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, who actually did anti-Asian war propaganda during World War II. So this is not just off-the-kilter crazy people doing these images. These are mainstream images to sell food products, to be in comics and all that. These grotesques became absolutely true inside of comic books as well. We can see in early comics characters such as Madame Fatal, who apparently she didn't even know how to spell her name because it changes with an E or not at various different times. And she first appeared in Action Comics in 1940. Madame Fatal was a male actor who, of course, found the only way to fight crime, because his daughter had been kidnapped, was to dress up as an old woman. And then you beat the shit out of them with your cane. Tonight I shall become an old woman, okay, and all that. That character was existent for a long period of time. And then we had, in 1988, the strange character of Extraño, which, of course, I know that many people here speak Spanish far better than I do, which means in Spanish, weird or strange, right, And Extraño was not only a clearly queer character. I mean, he often talked to himself in female terms. He was flamboyant. You can see the pose that he's got going on there. And he always talked about himself in the third person as Auntie. Auntie's going to help you. Auntie's going to do this and all this. He had very flamboyant moves. He was a magician. He didn't do much, and then he dies, which is appropriate for a gay character during this time period. We even had grotesques of the idea of gays as sort of the PERV, the sexual deviant who actually overdoes it. And this is even in a very recent comic. They redid the comic called The Rawhide Kid, and you can guess where this is going to go. So they decided to reinterpret rawhide into a whole new meaning. Some people before this lecture were talking about leather, so it all fits. He was very sexually promiscuous and very flirtatious with everybody. As you see here, the smelly, the nasty, and the fabulous, of the Lone Ranger. He said, I think that mask and the powder blue outfit are fantastic. I can certainly see why the Indian follows him around. So we can see these gay stereotypes, these grotesques, in video games as well. And a lot of them are from not only in Western video games, but also in Asian video games that came over to the United States. These includes characters like from Final Fantasy VII. Mookie's kind of hard to see because he's actually on top. It's a little embarrassing right there. Mookie was the main character in Final Fantasy VII was a character named Cloud. You may have played him or been familiar with him. And in the game, Cloud can run into this NPC Mookie, who apparently likes hanging out with boys a lot. In fact, he likes hanging out boys in a hot tub, and he invites Cloud to hang out in the hot tub with him. And if you, as Cloud, join him in the hot tub, you're suddenly uncomfortable, and at the end of it, Mookie is kind enough to let you remember the evening by giving you a pair of underwear. Encode that as you will, okay? Later on, Mookie not only, Cloud passes out, and you wake up with Mookie on top of you, and he's apparently slapping you or something, grinding, we don't know. Maybe it was early Miley. And so it's even been suggested that Mookie might have actually molested Cloud. This is a subtext that's there. In Enchanted Arms in 2006, there's Makoto, who's got to be the single gayest person I've ever met. Literally, I'm surprised that this character, later, unfortunately I don't have the video clip here, but because of time I had to cut it, but this character is so flamboyant, literally your monitor will burst into flames every time he talks. It's quite wonderful. He's actually quite cute. There's Wanderer Mayuin from Shadow Hearts, who is an acupuncturist who, if you're a female character and he punctures you, as it were, it's all just no big deal. But when you're male, it makes comments like, oh, I've never tried this before. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this. All right. So he gives discounts to males if the males let them puncture him. There's similarly a seller of goods named Gerard Magamel, which you can see down here, and it's kind of hard to see because there's a text box there. You can see not only does he have the very effeminate characteristics, his actual position is like this, and when he talks, he bounces like that with his rainbow. He's just come off of his motorcycle with his leather daddy boyfriend, and the two of them are there. So these are examples of the grotesques. We also have a specific kind of hateful villain that appears, which is, or the grotesque, which is the other as villain. And villains are the most common way to portray the other. Whether it is, as we can see, and after we had what was called the Yellow Peril in the United States, the fear that Asians were going to take us over. We had the image of Sax Rohmer in England had created a series called Fu Manchu, and the image of the Fu Manchu of the evil Asian who was going to take us over was translated into a number of villains inside of the United States in comics. Here we can also see the idea of the evil Asian, which we have various different sorts of ones. I mean, you can see just how grotesque that these things are. There's a specific type of way that these comics then portrayed gays as villains, and most disturbingly with a guy named Jack Chick. Jack Chick created these series of things, and they're called Chick Tracts. Chick is an evangelical Christian who is off his rocker. There's no nice way to put it. He's decided that all Muslims are going to hell, all Jews are going to hell. Basically, anybody who's not him is going to hell. He's famous for having written a miniature comic book called, I think it's Deadly Dungeons, I always get the name a little bit off, but explained how in Dungeons and Dragons, you actually summon demons and drag people to hell and then die, and so, you know, it's what we do in the evenings, and drive people to suicide. And so in this one, we can see where this is from one of his Chick Tracts from 1960, where the gay couple who has demons riding them are here to explain what it is. The evil teacher, I love that, you know, the sucked in face, great thing. And it shows how the people in Sodom and Gomorrah were actually, I guess, drag queens here kissing each other with lots of sweat, you know. The best part is, does anybody recognize what that image is back there? Does anybody know what that is? That's actually the cover of the Player's Handbook of Dungeons and Dragons. That's where he got his historical reference from, all right? And so, so there it was. In video games, the same sort of thing occurred. What we did is, instead of saying somebody was gay, though, how did you encode somebody was gay, particularly if they're male? Because villains are mostly male in these games early on. Well, they're effeminate, so highly effeminate characters as the villains. So, for example, inside of Super Punch-Out in 1987, Don Flamenco, just before he began, he was one of the easiest villains to punch out. He would start with a flourish. He always talked about how good his hair was, how beautiful he was, how beautiful the referee's hair was, right? And don't disturb his hair. The secret, of course, was that if you punched him, you could knock off his toupee and embarrass him, and then he would get all prissy on you. And so this is, again, using that image of what we call the pansy. Interestingly enough, Don Flamenco, later on, they remade Super Punch-Out, and they did something that I call het washing. In other words, they had to make him macho and masculine. So now, why does he dance? And you can see that's such a masculine pose, right? You know, but why does he do it? To attract the ladies. And so now he's a ladies' man. And so we've het washed him. We've made him heterosexual in reference. In Streets of Rage, which was one of those Super Punch-Out, you know, side-to-side striking games, there was a character called Ash, which also they het washed out. He was only in the Japanese version of the game, but apparently having a muscle leather daddy that would attack you was too much for American audiences, and so he was taken out as well. There's a special subtype of villain, though, that you see known as the sexual predator. And this is one that's gone back from racial stereotypes, and this is particularly true for blacks in the United States. If you look at the literature, and if in examining things such as, for example, if you read Reconstruction works such as But There Was No Peace by Rabel, which is a very important book on violence and Reconstruction published in the 1980s, you can see that there's this idea of the fear of the black man as a sexual predator. That idea of the black person as Sambo, the happy-go-lucky slave, changes, and now, because blacks are free, they are threatening. They're going to take our white women, they're going to rape them, and this is, of course, the excuse that the Ku Klux Klan uses to lynch and murder black people. And this is reinforced in visual media. So here we have a cartoon where you see the white woman sitting on the lascivious black man's lap in the carriage, and the cartoon image is discussing how that clearly he enjoys having the white woman sitting on his lap. And here, this is actually a cartoon from later that is from the Citizens Council of Dallas County, which actually was explaining the dangers of racial mixing and desegregation, and how your daughter might end up banging a black man, and how that might end up, and how he would predatorily be there, and there would be, and this is, notice the pot, that's racial mixing and how evil that's going to be. So the cartoons have been used as propaganda to talk about this sort of danger of the sexual predator. In comics, in Marvel Comics, the very first time we have openly gay characters appearing, it was as two villains who were attempting to rape Bruce Banner. Rape Bruce Banner in the YMCA, which, if you get more stereotypical than that, gay people in the YMCA trying to bang you, all right? But, as you might guess, trying to rape Bruce Banner is not a good idea, all right? You know, bad touch make Hulk angry, okay? So here they are attempting to do it, and actually you can see where he's about to take off his clothes and rape Bruce Banner. Interestingly enough, the two characters are very much modeled off of A Clockwork Orange, because this guy is very British and set up in that regard. It's very Roddy McDowell. Oh crap! What did I just do? It froze. I don't know what I did. Oh, there we go. Okay. We also had, particularly in the 1980s, Republican spin doctors began to use comic books in order to spread how gays were evil and horrible and sexual predators. And Dick Hafer, and I kid you not, that's really his name, all right, created a series of comics showing how gays were diseased and full of AIDS. You can see how that all gays, and look at how effeminate that is, that they're full of flies because basically them serving you food is going to give you AIDS. And then, of course, the gay man is trying to fuck the drunk down here so he can share AIDS with you as well. And this was a comic that I actually encountered it in the 1980s myself. What about gays as sexual predators in video games? Well, full motion video was considered all the rage very early on because this was the first time you actually saw real people in things. It's like little QuickTime events. Of course, as movie technology, it sucked and full motion video became unpopular. But in the game Dracula Unleashed in 1993 was the first time we had a full motion video character who clearly was encoded to be gay. This guy on the side named Alfred Horner. I want you to listen very carefully to what he says. This is a guy who's fighting Dracula, all right? Very masculine, very powerful. Listen to the opening and watch the handshake that's about to occur. Or there'd be no sound, so that makes no sense. All right, very good. Do we have sound at all? No, no. All right, I will make it work. All right, let's, whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay. I will narrate. I'm so happy that I'm going to be joining your club, and he says, oh shit, I got the timing off. All right, anyway, he says, what he says is he holds out his hand like a pansy. The male guy, and he says, because the guy says, I'm here because I'm going to be joining your Hellfire Club. And he says, oh, we're so happy we're going to have you in our club. And of course, the second he does that and puts his effeminate hand in there, what's his reaction? He immediately jerks his hand away and shows disgust. All right. And of course, Horner later ends up being a villain. He's in league with Dracula. So the encoding of the gay man as sexual predator, if you even look up like on Wikipedia entries or on game dub entries, they always talk about how much he's leering at the main character. The first visual appearance of a gay character in a video game. We even have sexual predators in modern day. This is a Flash game that's out in France. Which my French is terrible, so I will not attempt to pronounce the French, but it's Guard Your Ass Hunter, which you can play online. I don't suggest it, but it allows you to play this lovely hunter down here, and naked men with erections will come at you, and if they get you, they will reduce one of your asses, all right? And the only way to deal with them is to blow them away with the shotgun, leaving bloody gay messes on the ground. Tactful, all right? When we move to submissive portrayals, we see actually in both comics and in editorial cartoons, the ideas of the grotesques are now meant for humor. So instead of Snow White, you have Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves. You have, this is actually the head of a music pamphlet, and you can see that all coons look alike to me. There's racial sensitivity, right? You know. And then we have, and I don't know if have you seen any of the old Tom and Jerry cartoons? All right. Do you know who this was modeled after? The housekeeper? Because the housekeeper is very stereotypically the black mammy character, but actually it's kind of an interesting piece of history. Do you know who she was modeled after? Well, actually, no. Hattie McDaniel. Hattie McDaniel, who was the first black woman to be given a Academy Award for her portrayal as the mammy in Gone with the Wind. And so they actually meant for it to be a positive portrayal, but if we look at it now, it's very racist. And that's why when they've redone the Tom and Jerry cartoons, they've actually edited her out and put it in a white woman with heels, because instead of actually denigrating black women. Now we actually go for stereotypical white women. That's so much better. And inside the comics, we had the same thing. Racial stereotypes were dominant when we start talking about sidekicks. And so we see Wing Hao, and look at his lovely English. Wing take shot at greedy nobleman's bread basket, And there was also another Asian portrayal known as Stuff, or the Chinatown Kid. And so we can see that these are what today would be highly uncomfortable racial stereotypes. And these were meant to be for humor. The sidekick was never to be the main character. He was also supposed to be funny. So think about Robin, right? Robin was always the comic relief. So too did they start encoding comic relief by feminizing typically male characters. This is particularly true with cross-dressing. Cross-dressing is an image of the masculine character. So Jimmy Olsen, for example, began to, in the Superman comics, have a series of comics where he dressed up as a woman, and it was funny, ha-ha, because guy in a dress, and that gender bending put a little bit there, and so there's a whole series of comics in the 1960s that had Jimmy Olsen as Mrs. Jimmy Olsen. Video games also played queer for laughs. Inside of the game Harvester from 1996, we have here Fireman Sparky, and you can't see it because of the light, but that's a marvelously pink truck right there. And so you come in to talk to Fireman Sparky at the fire station, and look at what they're doing. Oh, they're actually painting naked men there. Which is what you always do in the fire station. And when the main character comes in, here's Fireman Sparky saying, "Hello, Steve. Welcome to the House of Flame." So it's obviously meant to be played for laughs. Similarly, sissy boy or cross-dressing was a popular image for comic relief as well. Again, going back to Final Fantasy VII, there's a point that Cloud, your character, has got to try and get dressed up as a girl if he's going to get to the next level. So he has to go and collect female outfits, and this is a whole series of mini-quests. And at one point, he meets Bro, the beautiful Bro, who actually has a wig. It's actually suggested that Bro is a cross-dresser or transvestite himself. And so as a result, you're supposed to end up getting the wig from Bro. What does Bro force you to do? He's only going to give you the wig if you engage in a game of competitive squats. So you get to watch your character doing butt clenching, all right, as an interactive activity. I don't think I have to explain the encoding there. There's a special, however, kind of encoding for lesbian characters. And I like to call this lesploitation, okay? Because when it comes to women, it's okay for women to have sex with each other because it's not real. It's only for guys to lasciviously look at. And so as a result, there have been images of what we might say is more sexualized female characters that are directly encoded as lesbian, but only, again, when the characters are not taken seriously. In Fear Effect 2, Retro Helix in 2001, Hannah and Rain, and look at this advertising. This was actually one of the double spread ads that you had in PC gaming magazines at the time. And it was trying to put up their entire sexual relationship as if they're having lots of sex in the game. Now, they don't. But there is one scene, and again, because of time, I had to cut it out of here. They're in an elevator, and they're concerned that the security is going to see them on the security camera. So they have to find a way to get past that security camera. And so the two of them start making out in the elevator to distract the guards, and the guards are like, oh, and they're all looking over there. And then your character, in order to get past that level, has to chide them, saying, "Boys, this isn't for you," and you use your dress, and you take off your dress and put it on the security camera, disrobing you. And then the two guards say, and this is so illuminating because the two male guards, what do they say? They say, "Oh, maybe we should stop them." And the other guy says, "No, because the dress might fall off and we could see them." Directly that lesploitation kind of image, the idea that it's okay for women to have sex as long as they're objectified as male fantasies. All right. We similarly, and again, the picture's so dark you can't really see it, and I apologize for that. In The Witcher 2, the Philippa. Now, mind you, this is a little old school because this is based on literature from Poland, which is maybe not most up to date in terms of gender stereotypes. But there's the Philippa. First time you meet her, actually, she's doing S&M butt whipping with her female assistant. So it's already an opening that's entertaining. All right. Later, she attempts to heal a character, and in doing the healing, she places a rose petal on her mouth, leans over and kisses the other character. And one of the dwarfs, who is your NPC who's with you, turns to the camera and says, "My favorite kind of magic, lesbomancy." So once again, the idea that it's okay to be lesbian as long as it's for the male objectification, and it's a little bit humorous. Then we have gay victims. The first time, and this idea is that the idea is it's okay to be gay, but we're supposed to learn that gays are submissive, that they're victims, and we're supposed to kind of pity their situation. Terry Berg was one of the first characters in Green Lantern as an NPC, as it were, a sidekick, to come out as gay. He had a boyfriend. Very soon thereafter, in this particular comic, he's assaulted and ends up being put into a body cast. It actually causes the Green Lantern at the time to nearly give up his job, but then they changed writers and Berg was written out. We never found out what happened to him. He was basically written out of the comics altogether. The first time that we had gay characters in comics that were main characters, the big one, and I remember when this happened because I was collecting comics at the time, was North Star. Of course, this is a big thing that they're going to have a main Marvel character come out as gay. Of course, it's from Alpha Flight, so he's Canadian. Who cares, But he was a character who could run faster than light, and this was his original portrayal, very sleek and all that. Later writers, Bob Liefeld in particular, who's kind of a douchebag, but anyway, they hyper-masculinized him and made all this, and he actually came out directly as being gay in a particular issue. But no sooner had he come out as being gay than he starts getting sick, and basically the writers had planned to give him AIDS, because of course you're in the 80s, if you're gay, AIDS, clearly, right? They decided he didn't have AIDS. Instead, they said, they backtracked on that, and they said, no, he's kind of a special guy. He's from another, sort of like he's one of the Fae creatures. You see, he's from there, and since he's been away from fairyland too long, he's actually dying because of that. So basically, he's dying because he's a fairy, okay? And as we all know, fairies can't exist in the real world for very long. Inside of Enchanted Arms, we have Makoto, who I mentioned earlier is this extremely queenie guy. He's hot for the main character, and when the main character gets into trouble, he sacrifices his life in order to be able to get the main character in one of the gayest saves ever, and he's like, "I'm telling you like it is, honey." And again, I don't have time to there's not the clip here, but if you look it up on the internet, you would not believe how gay this is. I mean, it's amazingly so. Most interestingly, actually, very early on in horror games, we began to see very mature portrayals of gay people, and Trevor Barnes was in a game called Phantasmagoria: Puzzle of the Flesh. This was the second in the Phantasmagoria series, and it's a adventure game that's full motion video, and the main character is actually bisexual. Then again, he also ends up being very creepy and bizarre and all this, and maybe is killing everybody. We don't know, okay? But in the long run, Trevor finally admits that he loves the main character, and this is like a horror movie, of course, because people keep on dying. So the second you admit that you're going to love somebody, he's about to lean in and kiss him, and of course, what happens when that happens in a horror movie? You die, all right? And so, in a Hellraiser-like way, from a tool chest there, a whole series of ropes come in, and they graphically kill him in a grotesque way. So the second you showed that you were romantic and gay, you got killed, all right? So it was there. In the modern day, we've begun to see more mature tropes for comic book characters to actually be out as gay or lesbian characters, and there have been quite a number of them that have come out. Apollo and Midnighter are from a series called The Authority, which is kind of like an alternate universe. Midnighter is basically Batman, and Apollo is basically Superman. And it's just, what would the world be like if there was a Batman and Superman, but they didn't give a fuck about killing people, all right? And so this is their primary way of doing things. And in this comic, the two become lovers and parents, ultimately, which is kind of interesting. Batwoman, who was reconceived, the original Batwoman was in the 1950s, was a very sugar-coated character. She's been reimagined as an ex-military lesbian who actually has become this main character, and she ended up is currently in a lesbian relationship. Renee Montoya, has anybody here ever seen Batman the Animated Series? Did anybody see that? Okay, if you saw Batman the Animated Series, she was first introduced as one of the two cops, along with a cop named Harvey Bullock. and they were the two that always were going to the crime scenes. And she was, one, because they actually had added a Hispanic female strong character into the series. She was still a minor character, but like many of the characters that have happened before, for example, you may or may not know that Batgirl was originally actually on the TV, and then she became a character in the comics. So too did Renee Montoya start off as a character in the animated series, became a character in the comics, where they then outed her as a lesbian. And then ultimately there's a character called The Question. And how many of you all have ever seen Watchmen? Okay. And who's kind of the paranoid crazy guy in Watchmen? Okay, Rorschach. Well, he was originally based on this character called The Question. In fact, the Watchmen was supposed to be based off of those comics, but it ended up not happening that way. So Renee Montoya takes over the role of The Question. Hulkling and Wicklin, which is probably the single most cosplayed at gay conventions for young males. It's a pairing in the Young Avengers, and they're still in a relationship from, and then Richter and Shatterstar from X Factor. But most interestingly, in 2010, just 3 years ago, in the Archie comics, they added a gay character to Riverdale High. And this character, Kevin Kellner, is gay, but he's very Archie. And he's simple, he's sweet, and he's just another guy. He just happens to be gay. And so there's been a real progression inside of the comics as to the types of characters that you can have. Inside of those types of sidekicks and stars, we've seen NPCs have been allowed to be gay characters in various different ways. We actually had the first canon gay character in the entire Star Wars universe appear in Knights of the Old Republic. And there was some question as to whether or not this was originally intended to be an accident, that she wasn't supposed to be talking about a female character. But this character, Juani, her lover gets killed, and depending on your interaction, you either can turn her to the light side or she consumes by the dark side for the fact that she's not able to deal with the death of her female lover. And so it's one of the first times that we see in a very early BioWare game the image of a female who's there. We have from Fallout actually a character Arcade Gannon, who can be one of your companions, and it comes out that he's gay. Most recently, and these are two of my favorites, does anybody recognize this guy? Anybody at Borderlands? Who is this guy? Sir Hammerlock, okay? And did you know that Sir Hammerlock was gay? No, you see, at first you don't encode it because he's one of the main quest givers, but in one of his side quests, because he's always after those monsters, he's a monster hunter, okay, and all that, he actually asks you to collect the pages of his boyfriend's monster hunting manual, and therefore, then of course he's there to steal the ideas, so they must be X's. But he's definitely very gay, which is wonderful. And then if you played Dragon Age or Dragon Age 2, these are the armorers Wade and Heron, perhaps the most fabulous makers of gay armor ever, all right? And they have been NPCs that have been encoded into it. So again, now we're beginning to see again that you can have NPCs in video games that are just as mature and colorful and have entertaining backstories, are fun, and are positive portrayals as you would inside of comic books. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, I should have explained. NPC means non-player character. So if it's not who you are, and I'm sorry, I should have defined that. Everybody knows games. All right, because I'm a blonde. Yeah. Because I'm a blonde. BLAND. All right. Anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, so yeah, an NPC means non-player character. So anybody who's not you, whom you encounter in the game, is considered an NPC. And all of those were ones who have lots of dialogue and main characters and all that, but you don't play them, you encounter them, all right? So where does it break? So if this comic book model, if these tropes can exist inside of various other places, where does it become problematic? Where does it not work? Well, there's two areas. One, when it involves romance, and the other when it involves the question of character identity, all right? One of the things that's been a real problem is that games have begun to define that you can fall in love with some of your, for example, in many games you can have a party of characters that are with you, and maybe you might be able to romance them and be able to have a storyline with them. Now, the games that are most famous for this are a series called, are games from a company called BioWare. The first company that they had a hint of this was in a game called Baldur's Gate 2, but it was most popularly seen in Jade Empire, where you could actually have a male or female companion whom you could snog up with, even if you were male or female of the same gender. But but those characters were ones you met second. And if you already had started a heterosexual romance dialogue with any of the other characters, the homosexual dialogue was cut off. You weren't able, so we just kind of snipped it short, okay? In the same sort of way, BioWare then advanced in series such as Dragon Age and Mass Effect, where you could have gay romantic relationships. There are other games. Fallout has had where you can have gay romances. In fact, actually, what I put up here, does anybody recognize? Anybody played the Fallout series? Okay, and what are these two characters? Does anybody know? What are those two images of? They are skills. They are absolutely correct. One is that's chercher la femme, which means that you get bonuses for seducing women and attacking them, and you can't have romances with women. And then I forget what this one is. Confirmed bachelor. And the same for men. So basically, you can actually identify yourself through a set of bonuses as being gay, all right? And actually tailor the game experience to yourself. The other sort of thing that's been interesting in the romance universe is games like The Sims, which actually by The Sims 3 allowed you, and actually allowed the universe and the characters. They originally planned to have a meter to decide where you were on the Kinsey scale, and then people would basically match up depending on their Kinsey scale. They got rid of that, and they said it doesn't matter the gender, and if you're playing in what's called story mode, where all the little Sims walk around town, they will fall in love with each other, and they don't care if they're male and male, male and female, or female and female. Also in The Sims, gays could get married long before we could in the United States, and gays could adopt. And so in The Sims 3 in particular, all of those images were there. And if you look at the progression from Sims 1 to Sims 3, you could have that. The other question is the question of identity. What happens when we are assigned a gay character? And that's still relatively fresh because it's already, most people perceive that the primary audience for video games is young males, right? And that's really not true according to demographics, but it is the perception, and advertising still plays to that. And because of that, we have a situation where, for example, games where you play as a female character, are those generally considered as popular as when you play a male main character? Generally not. And when they are female, what's the first thing we decide about the female character? Lara Croft or whatever, what do we tend to comment on? Yeah, her boobs, right, and all that, or how good she looks in her hot pants, right, and so it's very interesting. In fact, there's a defensive mechanism where young males playing these games have to say, I'm happy to play a female character, but the reason I'm playing a female character is because I want to look at their ass, okay, and so this defensive mechanism that you have to excuse the fact you might want to play a character that's not your gender is kind of crazy. More importantly, what would happen if we finally had a character, whether it's like a game like Heavy Rain or something else, or a Lara Croft? What if because instead of having to save the princess, you were a guy and had to save the prince? What if you were Lara Croft and you were having to save your old female love inside of that temple? And that's still not mostly been done, except literally just happened in the last few months, and it changed the end of my talk just recently. Borderlands 2, I know that some people have been playing it. Does anybody know the character of Axton? Who is Axton? Does anyone know? I saw it nodding. Do you remember who he is? He's one of the 4 select characters you can select, and he's a big, muscular, machine gun kind of guy. He's not the Gunzerker, but he's basically your soldier character, your clean-cut soldier boy, all this sort of thing. In the game, it can be single-player or multiplayer. And in the multiplayer, they originally expected that when you would reach down, if you were playing multiplayer and somebody dies, you can reach down and revive them, right, in the multiplayer. Well, when you do that, your characters usually say something snarky, okay? They originally planned it to be gendered, that when you reached down and said something to a male, it would be different from what you said if you said to a female. And so they had all these recordings. In one of them, Axton, since he was the soldier boy, if he reached down and grabbed the female, the siren character, he was supposed to say, you have nice muscles. Do you work out? Basically hitting on her as he's reviving her from the dead. Nice. All right. They got rid of the gendered thing because of programming reasons. So now Axton can hit on males or females when he's reviving them. And people started to notice that he was hitting on guys. And this, of course, made a big secret, like, oh my God, he's hitting on guys. And instead of the company getting rid of it, they decided, well, Axton's bi. And so they actually, apparently in the most recent DLC, are adding content that shows that he's actually bisexual from some of his backstory. And so he is the first AAA shooter character that actually identifies as bisexual that you have to play as the character. Now, again, this is very subtle, right? You have to actually really look for it to understand it's there. But it's one of the first big steps, and it happened because of an accident. So where will it go in the future? Depends on what we buy. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.